My name is Cassandra Hartley, and for most of my life, I believed loyalty was something you gave first, and respect would follow eventually. I believed that if you stood by the people you loved long enough, defended them hard enough, proved yourself quietly enough, they would see you. I was wrong. The day my father laughed at me in a joint briefing and told me to sit down, in front of 200 officers, was the day I finally understood that loyalty without boundaries turns into permission to be diminished. And once you see that clearly, there's no going back. I grew up on military bases. Not just visited them. Lived them. We moved every 2 or 3 years, sometimes sooner, depending on my father's next assignment. By the time I was 10, he was already a lieutenant colonel. By high school, he wore his first star. The houses changed constantly. Desert posts. Pine forests. Flat coastal bases where the air smelled like salt and jet fuel. But the rhythm never changed. Reveille at dawn. Perfectly pressed uniforms. Boots hitting pavement in clean, synchronized cadence. Even as a child, I learned how to stand during ceremonies, when to speak and when to stay silent, how to read a room full of officers by their posture alone. Rank wasn't just insignia to me. It was a language. My father taught me discipline and structure. He taught me how to observe, how to listen, how to never slouch or fidget when senior officers were nearby. What he didn't teach me was warmth. Expectations replaced affection early on. Dinner conversations revolved around leadership theory, operational doctrine, and command philosophy. When I brought home straight A's, he nodded once and said, "That's baseline." When I won a school debate tournament, he reminded me that rhetoric mattered less than action. I kept trying harder, convinced that approval was something earned through performance. He never asked what I wanted to be. He assumed. I overheard him telling colleagues at a backyard barbecue that I'd probably go into teaching or healthcare. Something appropriate. Something safe. I didn't argue. I worked quietly. In college, I joined ROTC without announcing it to him. I trained harder than most of my peers. I studied leadership theory, military history, and joint doctrine until I could recite it under stress. I commissioned as an Air Force second lieutenant at 23. I sent him photos from training. Updates about schools completed. Notes about awards earned. His responses were brief. Good. Keep working. Don't get comfortable. My mother would call later and tell me he was proud, but he never said it himself. I chose a path most officers avoided. Reconnaissance. Precision capabilities. Assignments that required extra schools and extended training cycles. Months spent learning advanced marksmanship, wind analysis, ballistics, meteorology. I learned how to calculate trajectories in shifting conditions, how to operate calmly when visibility dropped and time compressed. The work wasn't glamorous. It was exacting. I rotated through deployments most people never heard about. Joint exercises with Army and Marine units. Programs that didn't appear in recruiting brochures. Performance reviews started including phrases like exceptionally discreet and demonstrates mature judgment beyond rank. By the time I made captain, I'd been read into programs my father's clearance couldn't touch. He didn't know. And he never asked. At home, I was still just his daughter. Not Captain Hartley. Certainly not Ghost 13, the call sign given to me by a Navy SEAL officer after watching me execute 3 consecutive shots in near-zero visibility without hesitation. The name stuck quietly. Within certain circles, it meant reliability. Outside those circles, it meant nothing. And to my father, it didn't exist. I showed up for holidays whenever leave allowed. I helped my parents with errands. Paid for repairs when my mother mentioned the roof needed work. Drove her to appointments when my father was away. At family gatherings, my father dominated conversations with stories from his command. When he introduced me to colleagues, he called me his daughter. She does intelligence work. I'm not exactly sure what. When I tried to add context, he waved it off. Support roles are important, I suppose. Every time, I felt myself shrinking. The imbalance became impossible to ignore when I was 30. I'd returned from a difficult deployment, exhausted and carrying things I couldn't discuss. We sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us. He asked how work was going. I gave a neutral summary. He cut me off mid-sentence. At your age, he said, I was commanding a squadron. Real leadership. You're a captain now. When are you going to pursue something that actually matters? I told him my work was classified. He smiled thinly. That's convenient. Maybe if you'd chosen a real command track, you'd have something to show for it. That was the moment I realized I'd been translating my worth into his language for years, and it was never going to work. I pulled back after that. Fewer calls. Fewer updates. Surface-level civility replaced effort. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and didn't care. When I pinned captain, he cancelled 2 days before the ceremony. My mother came alone. When I earned a competitive joint assignment, he dismissed it as a place they send officers without futures. His belief hardened. Intelligence and reconnaissance weren't real leadership in his mind. I existed outside his narrative. Then came the briefing. MacDill Air Force Base. A joint operations auditorium filled with Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marine personnel. 200 people, from senior enlisted to general officers. I sat in the second row with my unit commander. My father was seated in the elevated section reserved for generals. The briefing was technical. Intelligence integration. Targeting protocols. About 40 minutes in, the doors opened. A Navy captain walked straight to the front, purposeful, unapologetic. He scanned the room and spoke clearly. I need a sniper with TS/SCI and compartmental access. Immediately. The room froze. I stood without hesitation. Before the Navy captain could respond, my father's voice cut through the silence. Sit down. You're a nobody. He laughed. Loud enough for everyone to hear. I didn't sit. I looked forward. The Navy captain studied me, then asked one question. Call sign? Ghost 13, I answered. I didn't look back, but I felt the shift. The laughter died. The certainty drained from my father's posture. He knew the name. Not the details, but the weight. The Navy captain nodded once. She's with me. And just like that, the room understood something my father never had. That moment changed everything. I followed the Navy captain out of the auditorium without looking back. I didn't need to. I could feel the silence pressing in behind me, the kind of silence that only happens when a room full of disciplined professionals witnesses something that wasn't supposed to happen. A moment when rank failed to protect certainty. When truth cut straight through authority. In the hallway, the captain slowed until I matched his pace. Your father? He asked quietly. Yes, sir. He nodded once. Different clearance levels? Yes, sir. He exhaled through his nose. That's a rough way to learn. We didn't dwell on it. He briefed me quickly. 3-day tasking. Immediate wheels up. Precision support for a joint element already staged. No margin for error. I said yes without hesitation. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because this was the work. The only place where noise fell away and everything made sense. The operation went clean. Quiet insertion. Tight coordination. Decisions made fast and executed faster. When it was over, we packed up and disappeared the way these missions always do. No ceremony. No applause. Just after-action reports routed through channels most people never see. I returned to my unit and resumed my normal duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened, because for me, it hadn't. What was extraordinary was what I'd left behind in that auditorium. My father didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. My mother left a careful voicemail 2 days later. Her voice measured the way it always was when she was trying to manage tension without naming it. Your father is confused, she said. He'd like to talk when you have time. I listened once and didn't respond. There was nothing to clarify. Confusion implies missing information. He wasn't confused. He was confronted. 4 days later, Chief Master Sergeant Elena Brooks stopped me in the hallway outside my office. 26 years in intelligence. Sharp-eyed. Direct. Respected. Got a minute, Ghost? We stepped into an empty conference room. She closed the door and leaned against the table. Word travels. I figured. Your father didn't know who you were. No, she studied me for a long moment. Some people build their identity around being the biggest presence in the room. When they find out they're not, it hits hard. It wasn't sympathy. It was observation. You did nothing wrong, she added. Standing in your competence isn't disrespect. It's clarity. She left me with that and walked out. The fallout didn't come loudly. It came sideways. Family members called. Cousins. An aunt who meant well but didn't understand classification or boundaries. He's hurting, they said. He didn't realize. I didn't argue. Hurt doesn't excuse humiliation. Ignorance doesn't obligate forgiveness. I kept my answers short. Neutral. Professional. My father escalated. He contacted my commanding officer through official channels, requesting a discussion about my career trajectory and irregular assignments. Lieutenant Colonel Rohr called me into his office after the conversation. Your father asked questions he's not entitled to ask, he said evenly. I told him clearance levels and assignments are based on mission requirements, not rank, and that his relationship to you creates a conflict that excludes him from involvement. He leaned back slightly. He didn't like that. Thank you, sir. This is me being direct, he continued. Your performance is exemplary. Your reputation in the joint community is exactly where it should be. Don't let someone else's discomfort make you doubt that. Professional circles reacted differently. A brigadier general approached me at a reception weeks later. Heard about MacDill, he said casually. Difficult position. Might be worth considering your father's perspective. I met his eyes. Sir, my father made assumptions without asking questions. When those assumptions collapsed publicly, the embarrassment followed naturally. That's unfortunate, but not my responsibility. He nodded slowly and changed the subject. The boundary held. My father sent an email a week later. 3 paragraphs. He said he was owed respect as both a general officer and a father. He said my actions had undermined his credibility. He demanded context for how I'd obtained clearances beyond his level. I read it twice. Then I replied with one sentence. My work is classified. You are not read in. I will not justify my service. I sent it and closed my laptop. The reaction rippled outward. My mother called again, her voice tight. He feels you're being insubordinate. I'm not in his chain of command, I said calmly. Insubordination isn't possible. Silence on the other end. You know what I mean. I do. And my answer stands. Rumors spread quietly. Military communities always talk. A general who didn't know his own daughter's professional standing. A public miscalculation. People began to examine his leadership style more critically. Command climate surveys surfaced patterns. Dismissiveness. Arrogance. High staff turnover. I didn't celebrate it. I recognized it. Authority that depends on never being questioned eventually cracks. My path strengthened. I was promoted to major at 33 with strong recommendations from joint commands. Requests for my participation came through formal channels. Army. Navy. Marines. Operators asked for Ghost 13 by name, not because of who my father was, but because of what I'd done. Captain Hale sent formal praise through my chain of command. Reliable, precise, professional. Words that carry weight when they come from that community. My father's influence waned. Fewer invitations. Quiet conversations about early retirement. My mother mentioned it during one of our infrequent calls. He's tired, she said. He's thinking of stepping down earlier than planned. That's his choice, I said. He's not happy. I'm sorry to hear that, Mom. And I was. But his unhappiness wasn't something I could fix without breaking myself. Months passed. Distance settled into something steady. Then he asked to meet. Not as a general. As a father. Neutral ground. A coffee shop off base. Civilian clothes. He looked older. Smaller. Without the uniform, the authority didn't follow him automatically. He admitted he'd been wrong. That he'd assumed. That he'd needed to reassert control when he felt it slipping. That he'd seen the call sign before and understood exactly what it meant. I humiliated you, he said quietly. And I can't undo that. I didn't absolve him. I set terms. Boundaries. Limited contact. No access. No explanations. Respect shown, not assumed. He agreed. Quickly. Almost eagerly. We shook hands when we left. Formal. Appropriate. Something new. I drove back to base feeling something complex. Not forgiveness. Not victory. Acceptance. The understanding that some relationships don't break in a single moment. They fracture over years. And healing, if it comes at all, doesn't restore what was lost. It builds something smaller, sturdier, and real. I stopped performing after that. Stopped reporting milestones. Stopped shrinking. I let my work speak in rooms that mattered. I stood straight without wondering how he'd interpret it. I understood finally that the approval I'd been chasing never existed in the form I needed. And once I stopped chasing it, the weight lifted. The climax hadn't been the briefing. It was what followed. The quiet decision to choose myself. To stop explaining my worth to someone committed to misunderstanding it. That decision changed everything. Time did what confrontation never could. It clarified things. I didn't change my behavior to punish my father, and I didn't soften it to comfort him. I simply stayed consistent, professional, boundaried. And that consistency forced him to face something rank had protected him from for decades. Reality without deference. My career moved forward without him in it. Quietly. Cleanly. I took assignments that mattered, not ones that looked impressive on a resume. I worked with people who didn't care who my father was because they didn't need to. They cared about outcomes. About precision. About trust under pressure. My evaluations reflected that. My name began appearing on request lists across joint commands. Not as a curiosity. As a requirement. My father retired earlier than planned. 33 years of service. A ceremony I attended but didn't speak at. I watched him stand at the podium, thank colleagues, accept plaques, and close a chapter he'd built his entire identity around. When the uniform came off, there was nothing left to hide behind. No rank to substitute for relationship. No authority to demand proximity. Just a man reckoning with who he'd been. We rebuilt something after that, but not what people imagine when they hear the word reconciliation. There were no emotional speeches. No dramatic apologies. Just rules. Clear ones. Monthly calls. No career interrogation. No minimizing language. No entitlement to access. Respect was not assumed. It was demonstrated or the conversation ended. Surprisingly, he followed them. The first time he asked a question and then stopped himself mid-sentence, saying, "You don't have to answer that," I noticed. The first time he referred to my work as important, without qualifiers, I noticed. The first time he said, "I'm proud of the officer you've become," without attaching himself to the sentence, I noticed. Change didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in restraint. What surprised me most wasn't his effort. It was my lack of urgency. I no longer needed his validation to stabilize my sense of worth. The years of distance had done something important. They'd taught me that respect gained after consequence feels different than approval given freely. And while it's possible to accept it, it's no longer something you organize your life around. I became the version of myself I'd always been working toward once I stopped performing for him. My confidence stopped being reactive. It became steady. Internal. When I walked into briefings, I didn't scan the room for approval. When I spoke, I didn't hedge. When I made decisions, I didn't second-guess whether they would sound impressive to someone who didn't understand the work. That shift changed how others responded to me. Junior officers trusted my judgment. Senior NCOs brought me problems early instead of hiding them. Commanders listened when I pushed back. Not because I was loud, but because I was precise. Consistency earns authority faster than volume ever will. Years later, when I took command, I understood something my father never had while he wore the uniform. Leadership isn't about occupying the highest position in the room. It's about creating a space where the most capable voice can be heard, even when it challenges you. Especially when it challenges you. I watched my father slowly learn that lesson in retirement. Through therapy he hadn't chosen at first. Through lost influence. Through silence that no longer bent around him. It was painful for him. Necessary, too. Some lessons don't stick until they cost something you thought was permanent. We speak now as two adults who understand each other's limits. Not equals. Not close. But honest. He no longer needs me to be smaller than him to feel significant. And I no longer need him to recognize my worth for it to be real. That balance is fragile, but it's functional. And sometimes, functional is the healthiest outcome available. Looking back, I understand that the briefing wasn't the climax of the story. It was the reveal. The moment when truth surfaced without commentary. The real turning point came afterward, when I chose not to chase resolution, not to explain myself into exhaustion, not to repair something that had never been built on mutual respect in the first place. Justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived quietly. Through clarity. Through boundaries. Through the freedom that comes when you stop shrinking for someone else's comfort. Today, when people ask about my career, I answer plainly. When they underestimate me, I let time handle the correction. I don't announce my credentials. I don't defend my path. I do the work. That's enough. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The people who need you to be less than them will always feel threatened by your growth. That's not your responsibility to manage. Your responsibility is to stand fully in what you've earned and let the rest sort itself out. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who should have supported you? Have you ever had to choose between shrinking to keep the peace and standing up for your own worth? Did they change, or did you walk away? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. And if this story resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Some lessons are learned quietly. Others echo. Either way, your voice deserves to be heard.